"Go on then. Start her up." The voice was slick with the kind of condescending amusement that only a young officer convinced of his own importance could muster. Captain Davis gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist toward the A-10 Thunderbolt II, its bulky, pugnacious form sitting squat on the hot tarmac. "Show us how it's done, old-timer." Roger Bentley, 82 years old, said nothing. He stood beside the aircraft's enormous front landing gear, his hand resting lightly on the cool rubber of the tire. The sun beat down on the flight line, making the air shimmer over the concrete. He wore a faded leather jacket, cracked and worn in the way that only decades of use can achieve, despite the sweltering heat. A small crowd of young airmen, on break from their duties during the base's annual family day, had gathered. They exchanged uncertain glances, caught between the discomfort of witnessing a senior citizen being mocked and the ingrained reluctance to challenge a captain. Davis smirked, playing to his small audience. "Come on now, you were telling my guys here all about the good old days, how you used to fly these things by the seat of your pants. Surely you remember how to flip a few switches." He pointed a manicured finger at the complex array of instruments visible through the A-10's bubble canopy. "Or is all that newfangled glass a bit too much for you?" Roger's eyes, the color of a faded sky, remained fixed on the aircraft. He wasn't looking at the cockpit. He was looking at the nose just below the canopy, where the paint was slightly more weathered. He was looking at the massive 7-barreled maw of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon that defined the plane, a weapon he knew more intimately than he knew the faces of some of his own relatives. He could feel the familiar bone-jarring vibration of it firing, a memory that lived not in his mind but in his bones. "Captain," one of the younger airmen started, a hint of protest in his voice. "Maybe we should just stay out of it, airman," Davis snapped, not taking his eyes off Roger. "The man wants to tell war stories. He should be able to back them up." "What's the matter, Grandpa? Forget which key goes in the ignition." He chuckled at his own joke. A few of the others shifted their feet, the silence growing heavier than the humid air. The captain stepped closer, his shadow falling over Roger. He jabbed a thumb toward a worn patch on Roger's jacket, a crudely drawn scorpion in a circle of sand. "What's that supposed to be?" "Your VFW bingo team." Roger's gaze finally shifted from the plane to the captain. He didn't look angry. He didn't look humiliated. He looked tired. He looked at the captain's polished boots, his crisply ironed flight suit, the silver bars on his collar that gleamed in the sun. He saw a man who wore a uniform but had no concept of what it could cost. A man who saw a legend in front of him and perceived only a nuisance. "The auxiliary power unit requires a ground check before ignition sequence," Roger said, his voice a low gravelly rasp, not in response to the captain but to the plane itself. "Hydraulic pressure needs to be stable at 3,000 psi. You don't just turn a key." The technical accuracy of the statement seemed to momentarily throw Davis off balance. He recovered quickly, his smirk returning. "Oh, we've got a real expert here. Look, sir, this is a restricted area. The aircraft is a static display for the event. I'm going to have to ask you to please step away and let my people get back to work." He changed his tone, adopting the loud, slow cadence of someone speaking to a child or a person they believe to be senile. "This is a very expensive, very dangerous airplane. We can't have civilians climbing all over it." Roger's hand dropped from the tire. His posture didn't change, but a stillness settled over him, the kind of absolute calm that precedes a storm. He had been a guest of the base commander, invited to the family day as one of the wing's original pilots. He had wandered out to the flight line simply to be near the machine that had been his partner, his shield and his weapon through the most harrowing days of his life. He hadn't spoken to anyone until Davis's young airman had approached him with genuine curiosity, asking about his jacket. It was Davis who had interrupted, his ego bristling at the sight of his subordinates giving their attention to a relic. "I'm not a civilian," Roger said quietly. Davis let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Right, and I'm the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. My patience is wearing thin. Show me your visitor pass, and then please head back to the public area." The demand was an undisguised insult, a clear implication that Roger was an unescorted wanderer who had somehow found his way onto the active flight line. The crowd was larger now. Families and other personnel, drawn by the confrontation, stood at a respectful distance, watching the drama unfold. The scene was stark, the young preening captain, all sharp angles and polished metal, and the old man, weathered and worn as the leather on his back, standing before the deadliest ground attack aircraft ever built. Davis was enjoying the attention. He saw this as a simple matter of enforcing regulations, of putting a confused old man in his place. He had no idea he was standing on consecrated ground in the presence of one of the gods of this particular church of steel and fire. He saw an old man, not the ghost of a 20-something major who had wrestled this very plane through skies thick with anti-aircraft fire, his hands steady on the controls while the world outside erupted in flame and thunder. "You want to see my credentials?" Roger asked, his voice still low, but with a new edge of steel in it. "That's exactly what I want," Davis said, crossing his arms. "Let's see some ID. Let's see the pass that allows you to be this close to a United States Air Force asset." Roger slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't reaching for a wallet. Davis's smug expression began to falter, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. What could this old man possibly have in his jacket that could change this situation? For a moment, a wild, paranoid thought flashed through the captain's mind. Was this some kind of security threat? He instinctively put a hand on his hip, closer to where a sidearm would be if he were security police. "Empty your pockets," slowly, the crowd murmured. The situation had escalated from casual mockery to a tense standoff. The young airman who had tried to intervene earlier now looked pale. This was going too far, and he knew it. This was spiraling out of control. As Roger's hand came out of his jacket, Davis's eyes were fixed on it. But it was the patch on the jacket, the one he had just mocked, that held the key. The faded scorpion. The sand-colored stitching seemed to blur for a moment. In Roger's mind, the oppressive heat of the tarmac was replaced by the biting cold of a high-altitude cockpit. The murmuring of the crowd faded, replaced by the high-pitched whine of two General Electric turbofan engines and the crackle of the radio in his helmet. The world wasn't a peaceful airbase. It was a chaotic desert valley, a kill box crawling with enemy tanks. He could see them through his targeting pod, Republican Guard T-72s, dug in and waiting to ambush a column of American light infantry. The radio was screaming. A young voice panicked and desperate. "Any air support in the area? This is Ranger 6 actual. We are pinned down. Taking heavy fire. We are being overrun." Roger's thumb had depressed the trigger stud on his control stick. The world outside had dissolved into the singular violent roar of the Avenger cannon. A solid stream of 30mm depleted uranium shells, a fire hose of incandescent metal, had slammed into the earth. The ground erupted. Tank turrets were ripped from their hulls. The memory was not a picture. It was a physical sensation. The aircraft bucking, the acrid smell of burnt propellant filling the cockpit, the grim satisfaction of watching the threats to the men on the ground evaporate into fireballs of black smoke. He remembered seeing the flash of a surface-to-air missile, the jolt of the impact against his right wing, the frantic dance on the rudder pedals to keep the crippled beast flying. That was the day he had earned the patch. It wasn't a unit insignia. It was a gift, a blood debt, paid forward by a grateful army captain who swore he owed his life, and the lives of his men, to the Warthog that had descended from the sky like an angry god. His eyes refocused on the present, on Captain Davis's arrogant, ignorant face. He had heard enough. One of the airmen in the crowd, a senior airman named Garcia who worked in aircraft maintenance, had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of dread. He was a history buff. He knew the tail numbers of the historically significant planes in the wing. He knew the stories attached to them. And when he saw the old man standing next to tail 780618, wearing a non-standard scorpion patch, a forgotten piece of trivia from his technical training clicked in his mind. He didn't know the old man's name, but he knew the legend of the pilot who had flown that specific Warthog, the one they called Deadeye. While Captain Davis was puffing out his chest and demanding to see a visitor's pass, Garcia slipped quietly away from the crowd. He pulled out his cell phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He didn't call security. He knew that would only make things worse. He called the one person on the base who would understand the potential gravity of the situation. Command Chief Master Sergeant Wallace, the highest-ranking enlisted man in the wing. A man who respected history more than he respected rank. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Chief Wallace." "Chief, this is Senior Airman Garcia from the 355th AMXS, he said, his voice low and urgent. He quickly described the scene. "Sir, Captain Davis is confronting an elderly veteran out by Warthog 618. He's being incredibly disrespectful. The thing is, Chief, the old man is wearing a sand scorpion patch, and he's standing next to Deadeye's plane." There was a moment of dead silence on the other end of the line. Garcia could hear the faint sound of a chair scraping back, the rustle of papers. When the chief spoke again, his voice was tight, stripped of all pleasantries. "What is the veteran's name, airman?" "I don't know, Chief. The captain won't let anyone talk to him. He's treating him like a trespasser." "Stay there. Do not engage. Do not let that captain move the veteran. I am on my way, and I'm bringing the colonel." The line went dead. Garcia looked back at the scene. Davis, emboldened by Roger's continued silence, was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The audience could now feel it in the air. Help was coming. Justice was on its way. Inside the wing headquarters building, Chief Wallace didn't bother knocking. He burst into the office of the wing commander, Colonel Matheson, a man with a reputation for being calm, collected, and utterly unflappable. He was in a meeting with staff discussing logistics for an upcoming deployment. "Sir, you need to see this," Wallace said, his voice cutting through the quiet discussion. He strode to the colonel's desk and spun a laptop around, a single web page already loaded. It was the base's digital historical archive, open to a page dedicated to Operation Desert Storm. On the screen was a grainy, sun-bleached photo of a much younger pilot, grinning, leaning against the fuselage of an A-10. Underneath the photo was a name, Major Roger Deadeye Bentley. The profile listed his accomplishments, his airframe, A-10 780618, and his last known status as retired, living in the local area. "Chief, what is the meaning of this?" the colonel asked, his voice laced with annoyance at the interruption. Airman Garcia just called from the flight line. Captain Davis is publicly harassing an old man he assumes is a lost civilian. The old man is standing next to that exact Warthog. Garcia says he's wearing the non-regulation Sand Scorpion patch mentioned in the after-action reports. Colonel Matheson's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Annoyance became confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep and profound horror. He stared at the picture on the screen, then at his chief. The color drained from his face. He knew the name. Every A-10 pilot knew the name Deadeye Bentley. He was a ghost, a legend from the war that had defined the Warthog's reputation, a man who had done things with that aircraft that were still taught as case studies in tactical genius and raw courage at the Air Force Academy. "Get the command vehicle," Colonel Matheson said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was already on his feet, grabbing his flight cap from his desk. The staff officers in the room sat in stunned silence. "Tell the driver no speed limits, and get me a direct line to the tower. I want that flight line cleared of all non-essential personnel." Now, back on the tarmac, Captain Davis had reached the peak of his hubris. Roger's quiet defiance had infuriated him. He saw it as a final, pathetic act of stubbornness. "All right, that's it. I've had enough of this game," Davis announced to the crowd as much as to Roger. "You refuse to identify yourself. You refuse to follow a lawful order to leave a restricted area. You've left me no choice." He gestured to two of his young airmen. "You two go get security forces. Tell them we have a situation. A trespasser, possibly confused, who needs to be escorted from the base. And while you're at it," he added, his voice dripping with spite, "tell them to have medical on standby. We might need to get this gentleman a mandatory evaluation." The threat was the final nail in his coffin. He wasn't just removing a perceived nuisance anymore. He was threatening to strip Roger of his dignity, to have him forcibly removed and declared mentally incompetent, all for the crime of standing next to his own airplane. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This had turned ugly, a public humiliation that felt deeply and fundamentally wrong. Roger finally met the captain's eyes, and for the first time Davis saw something in them other than weary patience. He saw a flicker of the fire that had forged a legend in the crucible of war. It was a look that had unnerved enemy commanders and stiffened the spines of men under his command. It was a look that said, "You have made a grave mistake." It was at that precise moment that the wail of a siren cut through the air. It wasn't the familiar yelp of a security police cruiser. It was the deeper, more authoritative siren of a command vehicle. Heads turned as a black SUV, its emergency lights flashing, tore onto the tarmac at a speed that was strictly forbidden. It skidded to a halt just yards from the A-10, kicking up a cloud of dust. A maintenance truck screeched to a stop right behind it. The doors of the SUV flew open. Colonel Matheson emerged, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. He didn't even glance at the crowd. His eyes scanned the scene, found Roger Bentley, and locked on. Chief Wallace was half a step behind him, followed by a team of senior maintenance NCOs who moved with the kind of disciplined urgency that signaled a major event was unfolding. The crowd, which had been murmuring, fell into a dead, reverent silence. Captain Davis stared, his mouth slightly agape. He had called for the cops to remove an old man. Instead, the highest level of base leadership had arrived as if responding to a 4-alarm fire. He couldn't process what was happening. Colonel Matheson strode past Davis as if he were a piece of unimportant scenery. He didn't stop, didn't speak to him, didn't even acknowledge his existence. His entire focus was on the old man in the leather jacket. He marched directly to Roger, stopped precisely 3 feet in front of him, and drew himself to his full height. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the assembled airmen, Colonel Matheson, the wing commander, a man who commanded thousands of personnel and a fleet of deadly aircraft, snapped to the most rigid, impeccable salute Captain Davis had ever witnessed. It was not the casual salute one officer gives another. It was a salute of profound, almost worshipful respect. "Mr. Bentley," the colonel's voice boomed across the silent tarmac, sharp and clear. "It is an honor to have you on my flight line, sir." Roger Bentley looked at the colonel, at the silver eagle on his collar, and gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. The salute was held. Matheson then dropped his salute and turned, his eyes finally landing on Captain Davis. The look he gave him was not one of anger, but of cold, weaponized disappointment. He then addressed the entire crowd, his voice carrying the full weight of his command. "For those of you who were not aware," he began, his voice resonating with power, "you are standing in the presence of Major Roger Bentley, United States Air Force, retired, though he would be too humble to ever tell you himself." He gestured to the A-10 behind Roger. "This is not just any Warthog. This is Tail 780618. This is his aircraft." Major Bentley, then known as Deadeye Bentley, flew this exact airframe for over 2,000 hours. Nearly half of those were in combat. A ripple of awe went through the crowd. The airmen who had been slouched in discomfort now stood ramrod straight, their eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning reverence. "During Operation Desert Storm," the colonel continued, his voice rising, "Major Bentley was credited with the confirmed destruction of 23 T-72 tanks, 16 armored personnel carriers, and over 30 artillery pieces, more enemy armor than any other single pilot in the theater of operations." He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. Then he pointed directly at the faded scorpion patch on Roger's jacket. "And this patch, Captain Davis, is not from a bingo team. This patch was given to him by the commander of the 3rd Ranger Battalion. It was given to him after a mission where Major Bentley, flying this plane, single-handedly engaged and destroyed an entire enemy mechanized company that had ambushed and surrounded a platoon of Army Rangers. He saved every single one of them. He did so after taking a missile hit to his starboard engine, and he flew this bird back to base with half a wing on fire and hundreds of shrapnel holes in the fuselage. He refused to eject because he was worried the plane would crash into a civilian village." The story hung in the air, a stunning testament to the quiet, unassuming man standing before them. The crowd was speechless. The young airmen looked at Roger as if seeing him for the first time, not as an old man but as the living embodiment of the heritage they had only ever read about in books. Colonel Matheson now turned the full force of his glare onto the pale, trembling Captain Davis. "Captain," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing level that was far more terrifying than a shout, "you will be in my office tomorrow morning at 0600 hours in your service dress uniform. You will be prepared to explain to me, in excruciating detail, why you felt it was appropriate to humiliate a decorated hero of the United States Air Force. You will explain your absolute failure of leadership, of judgment, and of basic human decency. You will explain why you still deserve the privilege of wearing that uniform, because from where I'm standing you have profoundly disgraced it today. Am I understood?" "Yes, Colonel," Davis whispered, his voice barely audible. Matheson turned back to Roger, his expression softening immediately. "Sir, on behalf of the entire wing, I am deeply and profoundly sorry for the disrespect you were shown here today." Roger Bentley finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, carrying a wisdom that made everyone lean in to listen. "He's young, Colonel. All he sees is the uniform, the rank, the rules of the present. He doesn't see the man who wore it a lifetime ago. He looks at this airplane and sees an old, obsolete machine. He doesn't see the history written on its skin, the souls it carried, or the lives it saved on the ground." He looked past the colonel, his gaze sweeping over the young airman. "Respect isn't about saluting the man in front of you. It's about remembering the sacrifices of everyone who came before you. Without that memory, the uniform is just a costume." As he spoke of memory, one last image flashed in his mind, sharp and clear, not of fire and combat, but of the quiet aftermath. He saw himself much younger, standing on the flight line in a Saudi Arabian desert base, next to his battered, smoking A-10. A young Army captain, his face covered in grime and streaked with tears of relief, was pressing a small hand-stitched patch into his hand. The scorpion patch. "We wouldn't be here without you, sir," the ranger had said, his voice thick with an emotion too raw for words. "The men, they wanted you to have this. You're one of us now. You're a sand scorpion." The patch wasn't a decoration. It was a contract, a symbol of lives saved, of a debt that could never truly be repaid, but would always be remembered. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from that day on the flight line was swift and decisive. Captain Davis was formally reprimanded, and quietly reassigned to a dreary desk job at a remote logistics command, his once promising career as a pilot effectively over. Colonel Matheson, true to his word, instituted a new mandatory professional development course for all officers in the wing, focused entirely on Air Force heritage, with the story of Major Roger Bentley and Tail 780618 as its opening lesson. The wing officially dedicated the aircraft, mounting a gleaming bronze plaque just below the cockpit that detailed the heroic service of the plane and its legendary pilot. The base command issued a formal apology to Roger, which he accepted with quiet grace. He wanted no fanfare, no ceremony. The vindication was enough. About a month later, Roger was sitting in a small off-base coffee shop, reading the morning paper. The bell over the door jingled, and in walked a man in civilian clothes, his shoulders slumped, his face tired. It was the former Captain Davis. He saw Roger, froze for a moment, and then after a long hesitation walked over to the table. He stood there awkwardly, not sure what to say. Roger looked up from his paper, his expression neutral, waiting. Finally, the man spoke, his voice quiet and stripped of all its former arrogance. "Sir," he began, I know an apology isn't enough, but I wanted you to know, they made me read your entire service record, every mission report, every citation." He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service." It wasn't the groveling apology Roger might have expected. It was something better. It was a statement of newfound understanding, of a lesson learned in the most painful way possible. Roger Bentley simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of closure. He then went back to his paper, and the younger man, after a moment, turned and left. On the flight line, Airman Garcia would often take new mechanics out to tail 780618. He'd point to the plaque, and then he'd point to the faded, almost invisible scorch marks still visible on the right engine nacelle, if you caught the light just right. And he would tell them the story of the day a living legend came back to visit his old warhorse, and reminded an entire base what true valor looks like. If you were moved by this story of quiet courage and earned respect, please like this video, share it with someone who appreciates our veterans, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.